everyone. John, where do you want to sit?
This is fine.
There?
Yeah, let's go.
John is in the middle. It is a pleasure to be here. I am Torsten Kolind. I have with me John Wolthuis from Twilio. And we both live in San Francisco, California. So it is very fun to get here. But I'm originally Danish and born and raised here in Copenhagen. John, so we're going to spend 25 minutes talking about this crazy company that went all the way from absolutely nothing to absolutely massive success. And you guys will be able to ask John questions along the way on Slido, which I think should be on your screens. So use Slido, give us some questions along the way. And I'll just give you a very, very brief background here. So this company, it's called Twilio. It's in the US, about 3,000 people or so by now.
Yes.
It went public about 2 years ago. How long ago?
2016.
2016. Has a market cap of about $15 billion. Bought SendGrid also fairly recently. And and I'm not going to pitch it for you, but the first question I have for you is, what is this thing?
So Twilio is it's a cloud communications platform. The way I've always described that in the past is sort of using the AWS analogy. So AWS lets developers come and buy storage or compute or various things like that. Twilio kind of had the similar model where we have APIs that we sell to developers kind of on demand, where they can buy access to the telecommunications network. So people could come to us and buy phone numbers, send and receive SMS messages, make and receive phone calls, and do automated systems around that.
So people being like, I run a web product, and
right.
I need my product to be able to send text messages and make phone calls.
Mm-hmm.
So I use your product to build it in, so I don't have to do it myself?
Right, exactly. So if you've been using an application these days that sends you an SMS or does anything over voice, it's probably using us. And that company's not going and integrating with the telecom network themselves. They're going through our APIs to basically do that orchestration for them. So if you're like an Uber and you want to send a text message to somebody because the driver's around the corner and didn't read your GPS properly, we're going to be the ones who are actually intercepting and sending that message through on Uber's behalf to make sure, one, that actually do the communication, and two, is to kind of mask the number so you're not revealing your caller ID to the driver or the driver's caller ID to you, things like that. So lots of applications, security. Two-factor auth, notifications, logistics, phones, traditional phone systems, contact centers. A lot of customer engagement use cases have been built out on us.
But that's not how it all started. I mean, you guys were three founders,
mm-hmm.
and you went to school together, or how did you guys know each other?
The CEO, Jeff Lawson, and I have done several startups together. I basically did nothing but startups. I've never actually worked for a large company for very long. So I've kind of went from startup to startup to startup, and we kind of got started in that in college. And then, so he started his first company, kind of dragged me out to California from Michigan, where we were going to school. This is back in '99, and then it was a horrible, basically the dot-com bubble crashed about 6 months after we moved out there. So that was,
Great timing.
Yeah,
well done.
There's worse places to get stranded than in California. But after that, we basically did a couple of companies together. He went back to school and ended up at Amazon AWS as a product manager there, and I was working like banking software, which I didn't ever kind of expect to be working in. But one of the early companies that we had built out was a company called what am I trying to remember this?
I don't remember.
StubHub. This was a ticketing kind of resale company that we were basically their kind of contract engineering team. They paid us in shares in like 2001, which was a terrible economic decision for us at the time. It was incredibly stupid to do. But 7 years later, eBay bought them, and suddenly all those lotto tickets that I thought were just sort of wasted time were suddenly like a 2-year salary got dropped in my lap. And about the same time that the economic crash hit, my big clients at that time were Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, so I was a little bit unhappy with the outcome of
that is also terrible timing.
But it was perfect timing to actually start a new company. And we'd been in previous companies. We were web developers, so we're used to being able to quickly put together applications. If you wanted to send an email, it was very easy to send an email. If you wanted to interact with the telecom network, it was extremely hard. What we thought would maybe be like an afternoon's work to send a text message or receive a text message and process it turned out to be like months of negotiation with a telecom, and you had to go rack some specialized gear and learn all these really weird protocols. And we always thought that was like a stupid thing. That should have been much easier than it actually was. So when the time came that we kind of wanted to go try and do another startup, we were kind of looking at some of the problems we had in previous companies, and that was one of them. And then also looking at kind of the landscape of like what new technologies and what new trends there were that were occurring, and that was basically Jeff's experience at AWS was like we were really interested in this idea of sort of cloud computing and sort of on-demand pay-as-you-go services. And so we had the idea for Twilio, which is basically that. It was like you could buy, you can go and sign up for Twilio, swipe your credit card, and start using us. You could buy phone numbers through us. You could actually start sending and receiving text messages and making and receiving phone calls. And we built it out in a way that was very easy for people with web development skills to operate in this world, as opposed to having to have specialized telecom knowledge. So that's kind of how we got started.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I think we often forget that this whole cloud world with AWS and all the other services is not more than 10 years old, honestly. Like 10 years ago, even 10 years ago, it was considered very risky to not operate your own data center and actually scale on something like Amazon Web Services. So you guys were very early in that sense, right?
We were very, yeah, it was, when we started, we weren't sure we could actually do VoIP over AWS. We actually started building out on AWS, and everybody we talked to at the time was like, you can't do VoIP over AWS, it just won't work. But we're like, but we're doing it, it works. It was funny, because like 4 or 5 years later, we'd like some story would come about us on on Hacker News or something, and there'd be a long thread on that story about how it's impossible to do VoIP on virtualized hardware. I'm like, that's like, but what are you talking about? We're like, we have, we've got 5 years of customers on this. Like, why? It was very strange how sort of you get these religious notions in tech that people kind of stick to.
And I think what's always fascinating with these stories is that when you are at that very early phase, like you don't know if it's going to work out or not.
Right.
It's either sit and look back and think, oh, we did this right and this wrong. But think back a little bit to those early days where you were, there were probably moments where you guys were like, man, this is not going to work. We're just going to throw in the towel. Like what? Do you remember like the crisis times of the old days?
It was very interesting to try and raise money.
Yeah.
We talked to a lot of investors. We built out the first demo version of the software. We had a bunch of beta customers on it. We had a lot of sort of use cases that we had kind of tested out. But when we went and talked to investors, to angel investors, and to like Series A seed investors, there were two things happened. One is there was always one partner who'd done VoIP in the late 90s and early 2000s who got burned really badly. Who came in and always vetoed the deal because they're like, no.
There's a lot of startups out here like, yeah, I know that feeling. I pitch, and some idiot investor is like, oh, I tried this in the 90s and it worked.
Yeah, everybody loved the idea except that one guy who was like, no, that's VoIP is poison. Don't go anywhere near it. The other one was we launched as an API company back when that was not something that was really common or had ever really been done. AWS was just sort of gaining traction.
Hang on, an API company as a venture-backable company. Like
right,
APIs had existed, but no one would go in and fund a company that just had an API for other developers.
Right, it's like we were basically a web service first company. Like the API was our primary product, and we were primarily marketing to developers. We weren't marketing to enterprise buyers. We weren't marketing to the CTO or the CIO. We were basically targeting developers and developers alone as a way of getting into companies, and that was our sales motion at the time. And this is something that people did not understand or kind of want to. Basically, the advice we got was like, why don't you go pick one of the point solutions that everybody wants to build on you, that you think is one of the big use cases people will be using for. Why don't you build that first? And if that's successful, then maybe you've earned the right to actually release the API. But they didn't want us to do it the way we were going to do it. So we kind of self-funded. We bootstrapped. We got some friends and family funding, and got it basically to the point where I was ready to launch. Kind of forced ourselves to launch because like this was the trick that my co-founder does, which is basically he goes and lines up a bunch of press and gets a hard date when the story is coming out, and then he tells us, it's like, oh, by the way, we have to have X working in 2 weeks because TechCrunch is going to release our launch article, so we better launch on November 28th because otherwise that would be embarrassing. And so it's a way of kind of setting a post in the ground and saying you have to focus now, and you can't keep tweaking and trying to get everything right. You've got to kind of get it out the door. So we basically did that, and about the same time that we were getting ready to launch, we managed to convince a few of the angel investors we were talking to kind of take the leap. I think we got Dave McClure to sign on from 500 Startups, and once, VCs are a little bit sort of...
Use the prototype on stage at
Yeah.
up to something.
He managed to, he used it to prank call Mike Arrington at one point, and basically got a lot. He's very good at like churning up press. But like once you have one investor kind of take the leap, a bunch of everybody else kind of comes in behind them.
So let's talk about that for a moment. It's always hard to fundraise, right?
Right.
You managed to get these investors on board. There's now a ton of pressure on you guys as a founding team and as the company to now scale and grow and reach those goals. So maybe talk to us a little bit about the scaling challenges of hiring, of scaling up that operation that this was now becoming.
It was, it was hard. We were doing something completely new. We had a small advantage in that we had a lot of really, really good word of mouth. We launched and we had people putting their credit cards in day one, and we didn't expect that. We were kind of expecting people to kind of look it over and think about it for a while, but like people were swiping their credit cards in day one and using us from day one. So it was a hard scramble to actually get staffed up and get the people we needed in place to actually keep up with the growth early on. So I think we were all customer support and operations and accounting and HR, like the three of us all were kind of splitting it up, which is a terrible idea. But yeah, the first thing we had to do was hire, and hiring was the hardest thing. Because at that point in the company, like we had some seed funding, far away from our Series A. So it's this incredibly risky situation to get into, and you can hire from your network, which is the best thing you can do because it's people you trust, it's people you've worked with before. You have confidence that you work well together. That's the best people to go after for your initial hiring. Those people tend to kind of turn out to be your co-founders at that stage in the company. After that point, it's really risky because the folks you're going to get are either really, really talented people who are going to make a terrible economic decision, because at that stage it's an incredibly risky operation to jump into.
Hang on. So you're saying the people you're getting are people that are willing to make a terrible personal economic decision to work with you.
Right.
And
it's true. It's startups are intensely risky, even if you think it's the best idea in the world. Or you're bringing in fairly junior people who have a much higher risk tolerance. Yeah. And so we kind of had a mix of the both there. We had we had a lot of people who are very, very enthusiastic about startups in general. Some of our best people were basically at that stage people who wanted to be founders themselves, people who wanted to be entrepreneurs themselves, but kind of wanted to go through the experience of an early stage company, and so very, very talented, but like also very headstrong, very, very opinionated, and kind of always had their eye on like the next thing. So it was the right thing for that phase of the company, but it's probably you have to be kind of aware of that's kind of what's happening and what the trade-offs are.
And I think probably a lot of the startups in here are struggling with hiring as well. It's always hard to get the right people on board. I'm curious as to that switch when you had in the early days where you're saying, hey, we're just hiring the people that we know that are sort of in our networks. You're three male founders. I mean, how are you doing on diversity at that stage? Because you're essentially building a very technical company, just hiring your friends and network at this point, and the switch out to say, hey, we now need to hire the best people, and we need to make them make, as you said, a terrible economic decision for themselves. How did that work out for you guys?
We didn't do as well in hindsight as I wish we would have. I think at the point where you're actually hiring people in at a fairly junior level and fully understanding that it's going to be a giant learning experience for everybody involved, you're going to be working very, very hard, and the skill level is going to increase just massively given like the responsibility that's being thrown at people. I think that's the best point for startups to actually start thinking about diversity, is because you're not trying to hire some specialist. You're not trying to hire like a public company CFO. You're trying to hire like a junior PHP web front end person, or somebody who's got enough Java experience from college. So that's the time when you should be bringing people in, especially because they're going to grow with the company. They're going to grow to be your team leads. They're going to be your engineering managers, your architects eventually. So that, I think, would have been the best time for us to actually focus on diversity more than we have. Now that we're a much larger company, it's a much harder thing. It's something we're very, very focused on, but it's a much harder lift. So my advice to other companies that are getting off the ground is really, really think about this early on, and make it a focus.
Yeah, and I think very related to that, one of the Slido questions is about the international expansion. and how when you go into having multiple offices and you're not there next to them all the time, how do you make sure that you still have the right culture? I mean, as a co-founder, I'm assuming that's a big part of your job at that stage.
It's hard. It's something we're getting. I mean, we've been growing very, very fast. We have many international offices now. I think we have an office in Malmo. We're actually just around the corner here. But it's we put a lot of effort into it. The time zones is hard. Getting everybody, like we have a lot of we have what we call the Twilio magic, which is like a bunch of our cultural sort of touchstones that we try and make a very, very broad appeal to all the companies that not all the companies, all the offices we're working with. We try and make sure that the executives get out to the offices fairly frequently, just to make sure that everybody's kind of involved. We have our all hands like every 2 weeks, which we try and do at different times of day to make sure that we're taking into account the fact that not everybody's in San Francisco, but it's hard. We have offices in Singapore, we have offices in Estonia, we have offices in Copenhagen, we have offices in New York City and London and San Francisco, and so every time it's basically you're inconveniencing massively a third of the company whenever you decide to have a meeting or try and do everything as a group. When we were smaller, we tried to bring everybody into the country, into San Francisco once a year for what we called Gather, which is our big corporate all hands for a couple of days. That's difficult to do as you get much larger because it's just so incredibly expensive. But it's a challenge. It's something that's really hard to do. So basically it's trying to make sure that everybody's kind of feels a part of the culture and feels a part of a company and feels like they're being listened to and their concerns are being met and they're also part of the product and part of the decisions.
And so about those cultural elements, are there any elements that have survived all the way from the early days up to today where you feel like there's a link to the original team, or is everything new today? In terms of how you work together and enforce the culture.
We have a lot of like core ideas that we had. We always had, so Jeff and I, because we went through like the first big .com crash, we basically had a company value which is be frugal. Like we remembered like in 1999, like you'd walk into like a competitor's office or a customer's office and there's foosball tables anywhere and there's like basically like Google-esque perks well before any of these companies had like Google-esque like revenue. And it always seemed, I called it the jinx, which is basically when you had basically ridiculous perks that are well outside your company's revenue or expectations. It was just poison. Like you're spending all this effort, you're spending all this money on nonsense as opposed to reinvesting it back into your business. So be frugal is one of our values that we kept really, really early on.
I remember
this thing called, we've got this value called draw the owl, which is, I kind of wish I had a slide to describe it. It's, there's a comic, it's a meme, which is basically like, how do you draw an owl? And it's like, first you draw these two circles, and then the rest of it's like, draw the rest of the fucking owl, and it's like a fully rendered perfect owl, and it's basically meant as a joke about how hard it is to describe how to do art or something like that. But we took it as like a, because it was, our company was so, we basically invented a new like category, like communications as a service, basically. So much of what we were doing was new that we wanted to like really ingrain it into our employees that you're kind of, there really isn't an instruction book for like what we're building. So you have to have, be able to take the initiative and have the understanding that you need to probably just figure it out for yourself if you're tackling a new problem or tackling a new direction. Like 12 years in, for some things there should be instruction books by this point. So that's a little bit more of a complicated value to have at this point because you're like, you don't want to be repeating all the learnings all the time, but like the idea that you're empowered and expected to be going and learning how to do new things and tackling new aspects of the business is something we've tried to really ingrain into our culture.
Yeah, so keep the questions coming, guys. We'll obviously, we only have until 2 o'clock, so I won't be able to fit all of them in. But I want to get to a little bit about the post-IPO, success. Now we're here. So you call yourself today, you pretty much invented your own title, as I understand it. You call yourself product architect. How do you describe your role today in a company that's that big?
So my co-founder is the CEO, and so he's very much taken on that role. I'm used to being kind of an IC. I'm used to being an individual contributor. I'm used to being kind of the technical co-founder. So I'm much more comfortable in that role than I am managing or doing, doing all the paperwork and the one-on-ones and that sort of thing. So at some point I managed to kind of step back, and I gave myself the title of product architect, which is sort of a fancy way of saying just sort of advisor. So I go and I have a lot of the institutional knowledge about why we designed the APIs we did, what mistakes we've made in the past, what product branches we've made, and so I act as sort of an advisor to our product teams as they're coming on board about kind of how we go about doing things. Kind of it's one part like historian, one part sort of tastemaker, one part kind of like consistency Nazi to some degree, but it's basically. That's sort of the role. So it's really interesting. It's really fun. Some people complain it's like I'm actually doing the fun parts still. So being a little bit selfish about that, but that's sort of my role these days.
Yeah, exactly. Because as a company grows, you often, as co-founders, get sucked into all sorts of operational processes, right? So at least now you have the flexibility to say, no, I actually want to be connected with the technology. It's always been a very technology-forward company. I remember in driving up and down the 101 freeway in San Francisco. You always see these Twilio billboards, and the only thing they say is like Twilio, and this is ask your developer.
Right.
And there's nothing else. And I think it goes to say that it's a very developer-first type of company and product that I think you guys should be really proud of.
I think we were really proud of that campaign, though it spoke to the fact that we had a very, very hard time building out our outbound sales team and our outbound sales motion to actually start selling into enterprises. In that if our giant billboard slogan was "Ask your developer," we were very, very good at developer marketing, and we've gotten much better at the enterprise marketing and the outbound sales in the last couple of years. But in the earlier intervening years, most of it was developer evangelism out to the developer market to get them to go and build something on us into their platform, and then the CIO or the CTO at some point would be like, what's this Twilio line item in our bill? Why is this getting so big? Why? And then they'd come and say, oh, this is this big, interesting, cool thing we built. So that was kind of how we got into companies, and it was a fantastic strategy. But at some point, you have to start being able to actually explain what your company does to the normal procurement chain in the enterprise world, and that's kind of what we've evolved into now.
So I hate to be jumping around the topics here. That's how it is when we have 25 minutes. But I really want to make sure we also talk about one of the topics of TechBBQ is sustainability. And you are now post the IPO. You've kind of made enough money that you're fine. And you're looking now particularly at, is it climate change startups as an investor? Maybe talk to us a little bit about why you care about that field.
So, I mean, climate change, I think it's anybody who's paying attention should be pretty focused on that, I feel. It's also a topic that kind of appeals to me as an engineer. It's this big, giant, huge systematic a problem that you're going to have to, a lot of it's going to be policy, but a lot of it's going to be technology. There's a fellow that I work with in San Francisco named Saul Griffith, who runs a lab that does a lot of climate solution technologies, and he's like, the job of a technologist is to make sure that the policymakers have options.
To make sure that policymakers have options.
Because you can do all the activism in the world, the policymakers can be pressured to actually make the changes they need to make, but if there aren't solutions for them to migrate people towards, then it's all for nothing. So a lot of my investment and some of my sort of philanthropy at this point is trying to make sure that people who have ideas, people who are making scientists or grad students who are actually working on new technologies are able to start moving those off into commercialization or making them available to people in a wider context. So that's kind of what I've been focusing on.
And if anyone out here wants you as an investor, what's the best way to do it?
I am still
ping you, email you,
LinkedIn you. You should write Torsten, and then Torsten can write it to me.
I'll help.
I'm still sort of working out my the exact structure of what I'm doing and kind of exactly the specific focus. But it's something I'm spending more time on in the future.
But we didn't get to any more questions, guys, but I want to commend you on what you guys have built. It's really, really impressive. And thank you so much for coming by Copenhagen to see us all. And hopefully you'll enjoy your time here. We're going to wrap it up and be ready for the next session. Thank you.
Cool.